Tokyo at night of March 9, 1945. The city does not sleep anymore. It waits. A distant hum builds over the dark horizon, faint at first like a vibration beneath the ribs. Then the sirens scream. Windows shatter open as families rush toward underground shelters, clutching children, photographs, and the few things still worth saving. Above them, the black sky flickers, not with stars but with the red pulse of approaching fire. Thousands of feet higher, the sound becomes a steady thunder. Dozens, then hundreds, of B-29 superfortresses cross the coastline, their bellies heavy with incendiaries. From the ground they appear like ghosts, invisible in the haze, engines droning with mechanical calm. Japanese night fighter pilots scramble from their bunkers, engines roaring into life, but they can barely see their enemy. The Americans fly high, then low, changing altitudes without pattern. The air glows orange now, Tokyo's tightly packed wooden houses becoming rivers of flame. From his cockpit, a young Japanese pilot sees the reflection of his burning city stretched to the horizon. His instruments shake, his radio hisses, and through the static he hears a single voice. The B-29s are back. Night after night, they always came back. By early 1944, the war in the Pacific had shifted irreversibly. Island by island, the Japanese Empire was being forced back toward its homeland. What had once stretched from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of the Solomon Islands was now collapsing under the relentless pressure of Allied naval and air power. The Pacific was no longer Japan's ocean. It had become America's runway, from the skies above Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, newly captured islands in the Mariana Chain. The United States Army Air Forces prepared a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Boeing B-29 superfortress. Massive, sleek, and bristling with advanced technology, it was built to bring destruction across distances once thought impossible. Its engines could carry it more than 3,000 miles. Its pressurized fuselage allowed crews to fly at altitudes over 30,000 feet, higher than Japanese fighters could effectively reach. For the first time, American bombers could strike Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe directly from the Pacific. But the plan to bomb Japan had been long in the making. Since 1942, when Tokyo first experienced the shock of the Doolittle raid, the Japanese military had feared this moment. Those early bombers, launched from an aircraft carrier, had been symbolic, daring but strategically minor. The B-29 campaign would be different. This time, destruction would come by the hundreds of tons. In Washington, General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, envisioned the B-29 as a tool not only of victory but of retribution. America needed a way to strike deep into Japan's industrial heart, to shatter its war production, to break its will to fight. The B-29 was the answer. By mid-1944, construction on the Marianas was a frenzy of engineering. Entire airfields were carved out of coral in record time. Northfield on Tinian, built almost overnight, became the largest airbase in the world. From there, long rows of silver bombers waited on runways that seemed to stretch into the sea. Each mission would take 12 to 14 hours, the longest, most dangerous flights any aircrew had yet attempted. Crews lived with exhaustion, cold, and fear. The B-29's four Wright R-3350 engines were powerful but temperamental, prone to overheating and catching fire. The men who flew them often joked that their plane was as likely to burn them alive as the enemy was, yet the logic of war pushed forward. The first major raids began in November 1944, targeting industrial centers like Tokyo and Yokohama. At those altitudes and 30,000 feet and above, the bombers relied on the promise of precision. Each aircraft carried the Norden bomb sight, a mechanical marvel said to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel, but Japan was not Germany. The jet stream, a powerful, high-altitude wind over the Pacific, threw off the bomber's aim. Flak bursts exploded far below, and when Japanese fighters did climb high enough, their engines sputtered in the thin air, leaving them nearly helpless against the American giants. Still, the results were disappointing. Mission after mission brought back little to show for the effort. Bombs scattered miles from their targets. Clouds and smoke hid factories. Entire formations missed their marks. By January 1945, General Arnold was furious. Billions of dollars had been spent on the superfortress program, yet Tokyo still stood. The B-29s were a technological miracle, but they were failing to deliver the decisive blow. That's when a new commander arrived, a man who would change everything. General Curtis LeMay, 38 years old, short, square-jawed, and utterly pragmatic. He cared little for ceremony or excuses. His philosophy was brutally simple. If high-altitude bombing doesn't work, we'll go lower. And we'll burn everything that stands. It was a decision that would redefine the very nature of warfare. The first experiments began in February. The bombers stripped of heavy defensive guns, carrying instead vast loads of incendiaries, bombs designed not to shatter buildings, but to ignite them. When the B-29s next flew toward Japan, they no longer sought precision. They sought fire. The change in strategy was as radical as it was ruthless. By early 1945, General Curtis LeMay's orders transformed the B-29 campaign from a high-altitude exercise in precision into a low-level assault of annihilation. The lessons learned over Europe were being rewritten, and the skies above Japan would become the proving ground. LeMay's reasoning was cold and mathematical. High-altitude bombing, even with the Norden bomb site, was useless against Japan's sprawling cottage industries. Thousands of tiny workshops hidden inside wooden homes and urban blocks. Factories were not isolated steel plants. They were neighborhoods. To destroy Japan's war economy, one had to destroy its cities themselves. The United States had already tested a new kind of weapon for that purpose: M69 incendiary cluster bombs. Each small bomblet, when dropped in the thousands, would burst open and spray burning jellied gasoline across wide areas. Wooden houses, tatami mats, and paper walls, the very texture of Japanese life, were perfect fuel. LeMay ordered the B-29 stripped of most of their defensive armament. Without gun turrets, the planes could carry twice as many incendiaries and fly lower, beneath the jet stream. Night raids would reduce the danger of interception. The cost in Japanese lives would be beyond imagining. The first test of this new doctrine came in February 1945, over Kobe and Nagoya. The results were devastating. Whole districts vanished overnight. American reconnaissance photos showed seas of ash where dense neighborhoods had once stood. And the pilots, once frustrated by missed targets, now returned with grim satisfaction. Their bomb loads no longer wasted in the wind. At the same time, Japan's ability to defend itself was collapsing. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service had once been among the most formidable in Asia, but by 1945 it was crippled. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Replacement pilots were barely trained, some with only a few hours of flight experience before being sent into combat. Japan's radar network, though advanced in parts, was incomplete and inconsistent. Entire regions of the homeland had blind spots. When B-29s appeared suddenly over a city, defenders often learned of the raid only when the first bombs began to fall. Night operations made matters worse. Japanese interceptors like the Nakajima J-1N Gecko and the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu were pressed into service as night fighters, but they lacked effective radar and coordination. Their pilots flew by instinct, chasing sound and flame through smoke-filled skies. Few returned. On the ground, the civilian defense system strained to maintain order. Millions of men, women, and schoolchildren were organized into bokutai, neighborhood fire brigades equipped with buckets, sand, and bamboo poles. Against incendiary bombs, they were powerless. Entire wards would ignite faster than they could react, wind and heat creating tornadoes of flame that consumed everything. By March 1945, LeMay's confidence had hardened into conviction. The new plan, Operation Meeting House, would be the largest air raid in history. Nearly every B-29 available in the Pacific would take part. The targets were chosen not for military value, but for flammability. Tokyo's Shitamachi district, a dense maze of small wooden homes and workshops, was the heart of the plan. The intent was clear: to incinerate the city's industrial and civilian core in a single overwhelming blow. Meanwhile, in Japan's command centers, disbelief turned into dread. Officers understood that their once proud Air Force could no longer defend the capital. Even if pilots were willing to fight to the death, they could not reach the enemy in time. For Japanese civilians, the nightly air raid warnings had become a grim routine. Families slept in clothes, shoes beside their beds, ready to run. Trains stopped running after sunset. Cities darkened under enforced blackouts, though everyone knew it made no difference. The B-29s came from above the clouds, from beyond imagination. American crews called them milk runs, missions with little resistance. For the Japanese below, they were nights of unending terror. In a war already defined by brutality, the skies over Japan were about to witness a new level of devastation, one that would turn entire cities into oceans of fire, and forever change how humanity understood warfare. When the B-29s came, there was rarely warning enough to flee. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, each city learned the same rhythm of terror. The sound of engines, the whine of sirens, the deep mechanical pulse that seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the shelters below, Japanese civilians could feel the heat before they saw the flames. The new incendiary bombs were not like anything they had faced before. They didn't explode, they breathed fire. Each canister opened mid-air, releasing a rain of small bomblets that scattered across rooftops, each one spraying molten gasoline in all directions. Entire blocks ignited within minutes. The fires joined, feeding on oxygen until the air itself seemed to burn. People ran toward rivers, believing water would protect them. But the flames followed, turning canals into boiling traps. Witnesses later described the wind as a living thing, hot enough to strip skin, strong enough to pull people back into the inferno. For Japanese civilians, the B-29 was not an aircraft. It was an omen. It came in silence at first. Then, with the endless roar of destruction, children hid in school basements that became ovens. Firefighters worked until their hoses melted in their hands. Priests tried to calm the dying with prayers drowned out by the sound of collapsing streets. By dawn, smoke blanketed everything. Those who survived crawled through ash where their homes had been, searching for family by the shapes of charred sandals or the glint of melted pots. The bombers were gone, but their message remained. Resistance was hopeless, and the sky belonged to someone else. The emotional weight of those nights broke something deep within Japan's population. What had once been national pride and unity began to bend under fear. Even the emperor's broadcasts urging perseverance were drowned out by the reality of the flames. The war had come home, and it came by air. For the men inside the B-29s, the war looked different but no less haunting. They took off from coral runways in the Marianas, each aircraft loaded with up to 10 tons of bombs. The flights lasted 14 hours, 7 to Japan, 7 back, across endless stretches of ocean where a single engine failure could mean a slow death in cold water. The crews were young, often in their early 20s, trained in complex machines that barely fit their own experience. The B-29's pressurized cabin and remote-controlled turrets were miracles of engineering, but they were also fragile. Fires, decompression, or oxygen leaks could kill silently. At night, the view from the cockpit was surreal. Below, entire cities glowed like molten metal. Through the clouds, the reflections of fires looked like sunrise. But it wasn't dawn, it was destruction. Many crewmen described a mix of awe and horror. They were told their missions would end the war faster, saving lives in the long run. But seeing cities burn, seeing the fires stretch for miles, left marks that words could not erase. Navigator Raymond Halloran later said, "We saw the whole of Tokyo burning. It wasn't a city anymore. It was just red, all red. Yet the danger was real even at low altitudes. Japanese anti-aircraft guns, though sparse, could still reach them. Engines overheated, controls jammed, and collisions in the dark were a constant threat. More than 400 B-29s were lost during the campaign, not from enemy fighters, but from mechanical failure, fuel shortage, or accidents returning home. For those aboard, the greatest fear wasn't dying, and it was failing. Each mission required perfect coordination, precise navigation, and unwavering nerves. A single miscalculation could scatter a formation across hundreds of miles, leaving planes isolated and vulnerable. And when they returned, exhausted, their base crews greeted them with silent efficiency. Mechanics refueled. Armorers reloaded. The next night, they would do it again. The men rarely spoke about what they saw below. The official reports were sterile. Urban area destroyed, industrial output reduced. But privately, many felt the weight of what their success meant. The war demanded obedience to necessity, and the B-29 crews lived inside that obedience every night. The B-29 was not just another bomber. It was the most advanced aircraft of World War II. Built by Boeing at staggering cost and complexity, it represented the pinnacle of American industrial power. Over 3,900 units were produced, each costing more than a modern fighter plane. Its design pushed the limits of aviation. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate comfortably at altitudes that would cripple most aircraft. Remote-controlled gun turrets guided by analog computers gave 360-degree defense. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines produced more than 2,200 horsepower each, allowing the bomber to cruise faster than most fighters. But these advantages came with risk. The engines often overheated, and the aircraft's size made maintenance a constant challenge. The crews lived in fear of engine fires, sudden bursts that could engulf a wing in seconds. Despite its flaws, the B-29 changed the rules of war. It could strike anywhere in the Japanese home islands while operating from bases thousands of miles away. Its massive payload meant that no target, military or civilian one, was beyond reach. Technologically, the aircraft embodied the American war machine. Vast, relentless, adaptable. Each bomber carried 11 men, miles of wiring, and enough fuel to cross an ocean. In the cold, thin air, the hum of the engines became a kind of heartbeat, mechanical, steady, unstoppable. To the Japanese defenders below, the sound became synonymous with defeat. No matter how many were shot down, more would come. And with each return, the technology improved. Better radar, refined bomb loads, and increasingly efficient incendiary patterns. The B-29 didn't just bomb Japan, it erased the illusion of safety. It made the homeland itself the battlefield. The combination of human fear, mechanical precision, and cold efficiency was redefining modern warfare. Yet behind these forces stood the men who commanded them, men whose decisions would turn the skies over Japan into a firestorm of history. General Curtis LeMay was not a man easily swayed by sentiment. Short, heavy-set, and perpetually chewing on a cigar, he was as unflinching in demeanor as the bombing doctrine he championed. To his crews he was blunt and demanding, to his superiors uncompromising. His belief was clear: wars were won by destruction, not restraint. LeMay had earned his reputation in Europe, refining tight formation bombing over Germany. But Japan presented a new problem. Geography, weather, and culture fused into a defense unlike anything in Europe. Traditional high-altitude precision strikes had failed. Now he saw the answer in total area destruction. His logic was cold arithmetic. If the B-29s could burn Tokyo's industrial heart in one night, they could break Japan's capacity to fight in weeks, not months. If that meant incinerating civilians alongside factories, he saw it as the lesser evil, the price of a shorter war. LeMay was fully aware of the moral gravity of his decision. Yet, as he later admitted, killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at that time. It was getting the job done that counted. He didn't seek approval from politicians before launching the firebombing campaign. He acted, then justified it through results. And the results were undeniable. The raids worked. Cities vanished. Industrial output fell dramatically. Japanese morale, once thought unbreakable, began to crack. Within his command, LeMay inspired both loyalty and dread. His men knew that mistakes were not forgiven, but they also knew he shared their risks. He often flew aboard missions himself, reviewing tactics firsthand, walking the flight lines at night to speak to exhausted crews. Strategically, his shift from altitude precision to low-level incendiary attack marked one of the most controversial transformations in the history of aerial warfare. It blurred the line between soldier and civilian, redefining what victory meant from the air. The consequences of his logic would echo far beyond Japan, influencing post-war doctrines, nuclear strategy, and the very architecture of deterrence in the Cold War. But in 1945, there was no theory. There was only fire. Japan's air defense network in 1945 was a shadow of its former self. Years of attrition had stripped the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service of both aircraft and pilots. Many of the experienced aviators who had fought over China and the Pacific were gone, lost in the grinding air battles of 1942-43. What remained was a patchwork system of aging fighters, improvised radar stations, and overworked anti-aircraft crews. The home islands were never designed for sustained defense. For years, Japan had fought a war of expansion, not protection. Now the war had turned inward, and the empire had no means to shield itself. The Nakajima Ki-84, Hayate, and Kawasaki Ki-61 Heian were formidable interceptors on paper, but without fuel, spare parts, or trained pilots, their potential meant little. Most Japanese fighters lacked the high-altitude performance needed to reach the B-29s at 30,000 feet. And when the Americans dropped lower for night raids, the defenders were blinded, unable to locate or track the enemy in darkness. Radar coverage was limited and outdated. The few effective radar systems Japan possessed were concentrated around key industrial hubs, but power shortages and bombing damage made them unreliable. Communication between radar operators and airfields was slow, often delayed by confusion or destroyed lines. When a raid began, chaos followed. Air raid sirens sounded across entire cities, but there was no coordination of response. Some pilots took off too late. Others never found their targets. The sky above Tokyo became a storm of tracers and smoke, with Japanese interceptors firing blindly into the inferno. Even the kamikaze program, which had terrorized Allied fleets, had no solution for the B-29s. The bombers flew too high, too far, too fast. Japan's most desperate weapon was useless against them. As losses mounted, Japan's commanders resorted to wishful thinking, training more inexperienced cadets, rationing fuel to a single sortie per day, and clinging to the hope that divine intervention or exhaustion would stop the American onslaught. But the B-29s never stopped. Every night they came. Every morning another city burned. And as Japanese pilots climbed into their cockpits knowing they would likely never return, fear, the kind no warrior could master, began to spread through the ranks. The bombing of Japan's cities has long stood at the crossroads between necessity and horror. Even among those who carried it out, the morality of the campaign haunted their reflections for decades. By the time the war ended, more than 60 Japanese cities had been firebombed. Over 500,000 civilians were killed. Millions were left homeless. Entire neighborhoods, cultural centers, schools, temples, hospitals vanished. Supporters of LeMay's strategy argued that it ended the war faster. Every night of bombing, they claimed, shortened the suffering of millions who might otherwise die in a drawn-out invasion. In their view, the destruction of Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka saved more lives than it took, but critics even then questioned the cost. Was the burning of civilians, children, the elderly, the powerless, justified by the promise of surrender? The question reached all the way to Washington. Secretary of War Henry Stimson warned President Roosevelt that the bombing bordered on barbarism. Yet the momentum of war had its own morality, the morality of results. For the Japanese survivors, there was no moral calculus, not only memory. In Tokyo, the charred remains of neighborhoods became open cemeteries. Burned earth replaced gardens. Survivors carried the weight of those nights into silence. Few spoke of it until decades later. The moral paradox deepened when the B-29s carried a new weapon, one that dwarfed even fire in its finality. But that moment was still to come. For now, in early 1945, Japan burned nightly under the wings of men who believed they were ending the war. even as they unleashed its darkest truth, that in total war, there are no civilians, only targets. As dawn rose over the ashes of Tokyo, both nations stood on the edge of transformation, one through destruction, the other through victory. And soon, that line would ignite into the most catastrophic night of the Pacific War. Tokyo, night of March 9th, 1945. At 5:30 p.m., crews of the 73rd, 313th, and 314th Bomb Wings gathered on Tinian's coral runways for the pre-mission briefing. The target, Tokyo's Shitamachi district. Altitude between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. Armament, incendiaries only. It would be the largest single air raid in human history. Commanders emphasized speed, coordination, and precision in destruction. The mission was codenamed Operation Meeting House, a cold bureaucratic title for what would become the most destructive night ever recorded. As the sun set over the Pacific, 34 B-29 superfortresses began to take off, their engines shaking the island. Each one carried a tonnage of M69 incendiary clusters, 1,665 tons in all. From the ground, it looked like a procession of metal giants ascending into darkness, wings glinting silver in the last light. Inside the bombers, the airmen sat in silence. Some prayed, others stared into the glow of their instruments. They knew they were flying into the most dangerous mission of the war. At lower altitudes, they would be easy targets for flak and fighters. But the orders were clear: fly low, drop fire, and do not deviate. 9 hours later, Japan appeared beneath them, a patchwork of blackness and dim lights breaking through the haze. The first Pathfinder aircraft, equipped with radar, identified the target area and dropped magnesium markers. White flares drifted down slowly, lighting up the maze of Tokyo's eastern wards. At exactly 12:08 a.m., March 10th, the first wave began its bombing run. From above, the incendiaries fell in long, glowing lines, cascading like comets. They burst open over the city, scattering thousands of small burning cylinders that clung to rooftops and streets. Within minutes, the Shitamachi district, a 16-square-mile area of tightly packed wooden homes, was an inferno. Wind from the Pacific blew through Tokyo at nearly 30 miles per hour, fanning the flames into a firestorm. The heat rose so violently that it sucked in oxygen from the surrounding neighborhoods, creating tornado-like whirlwinds of fire. Streets vanished beneath moving walls of flame that reached hundreds of feet into the air. From his B-29, Major Robert Morgan looked down and saw a sight that would stay with him for life. The whole city was burning, he said later. It looked like a sunrise that would never end. On the ground, Tokyo was unrecognizable. The fire spread faster than people could run. Asphalt streets liquefied. Bridges collapsed under the weight of fleeing civilians. Those who sought shelter in the Sumida and Arakawa rivers found only death. The water boiled from the heat above. Eyewitnesses described children on fire. Mothers carrying infants turned to ash mid-stride, and firefighters consumed where they stood. The sound was beyond comprehension. Roaring wind, collapsing timbers, and the steady drone of bombers overhead. At 2 a.m., the second wave arrived. Another 170 B-29s released their loads, this time targeting the western edges of the burning city. The sky itself seemed to burn, a dome of orange that could be seen from 150 miles away. In the darkness, Japanese pilots scrambled to intercept, but few ever found the enemy. Their instruments failed in the smoke. The heat turbulence threw planes off balance. The few who reached the altitude of the bombers could do nothing but watch as Tokyo vanished below them. By 3 a.m., the firestorm had reached its peak. Winds roared at hurricane strength. Entire blocks lifted into the air, torn apart by the updraft. Crews aboard the B-29s reported turbulence so violent that instruments shattered and planes nearly flipped from the heat waves. Even from 7,000 feet, they could smell the burning below. When the last formation turned back toward the Pacific, Tokyo had ceased to exist as a city. It had become a single, continuous sheet of flame. By dawn, the bombers began returning to Tinian, their wings streaked with ash. The air crews, numb from exhaustion, climbed from their planes into the blinding daylight. One by one, they were met with quiet nods from ground staff. There were no cheers, no celebration, just silence. Of the 334 bombers that left, 279 reached Tokyo. 14 were lost, mostly to engine failure or fuel exhaustion. In military terms, it was a success. In human terms, it was a catastrophe. Reports from Japan estimated 100,000 dead, 1 million homeless, and 16 square miles of Tokyo destroyed in a single night. The fires burned for days. The smell lingered for weeks. That night marked the moment when air warfare reached its most devastating expression, where industrial might, strategic logic, and moral boundaries collided in a storm of flame. And yet, even after the smoke cleared, the B-29s were not done, because LeMay had made one promise. If fire brought results, fire would return again and again. The fires of Tokyo had barely cooled when the order came to strike again. Curtis LeMay was relentless. He believed that only sustained terror from the skies could break Japan's industrial and psychological will. Within 24 hours of Operation Meeting House, ground crews on Tinian and Saipan were loading bombs again. The airmen, still shaken from what they'd witnessed, looked on in silence. The smell of burnt metal and oil clung to everything. This time, the targets would not be Tokyo alone, but every major city that still stood. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Night after night, the B-29s rose into the dark, their engines echoing across the Pacific like a grim heartbeat. The Japanese called them Bisan, the giant faceless visitor that came when the world went black. To the people on the ground, there was no pattern, no mercy. Every night could be the next Tokyo. Inside Japan's Air Defense Command, despair had set in. Their radar networks were primitive. Fighter planes lacked the altitude and speed to intercept the B-29s effectively. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the sky, lighting up the darkness with white flashes but rarely hitting their mark. By late March, LeMay had changed tactics again. He ordered that bombers fly in staggered waves throughout the night, rather than in one massed formation. The idea was simple and cruel. Deny Japan sleep. Deny them recovery. Keep the fear alive, and it worked. Factories that had escaped the flames found themselves crippled by exhaustion and panic. Entire neighborhoods fled into the countryside. Schools closed. Hospitals overflowed. Even Emperor Hirohito's staff reported sleepless nights as the sound of distant engines echoed. Over the imperial palace, the B-29s were not just destroying buildings. They were destroying the rhythm of life itself. Night in Osaka, March 13, 1945, for the residents of Osaka. The first alarms came at 11:57 p.m. The glow of flares appeared over the city within minutes, followed by the low, familiar rumble that had haunted Japan for months. In the darkness, 274 B-29s approached in waves, their target, the heart of Osaka's industrial district, and every wooden home around it. Within an hour, fire consumed 8 square miles of the city. More than 3,000 people died that night, many drowning in the canals as they tried to escape the firestorm. By dawn, smoke from Osaka merged with that of Nagoya, hundreds of miles away. From the air, it was a single, continuous pall stretching across Honshu. For Japanese pilots stationed at Itami and Nagoya airfields, the sense of helplessness was unbearable. Their Zero fighters could barely reach the bomber's altitude before running low on fuel, and even if they could, their bullets were useless against the heavy armor of the superfortress. One pilot later wrote in his diary, "We climb and climb, but the sky never brings them closer. The B-29s fly above the clouds like gods. We are only shadows, burning up the last of our fuel to reach a ghost." The strategy of Fire LeMay's plan was not born of cruelty alone, but of cold, industrial logic. Japan's war machine depended on small, dispersed workshops producing parts for planes, ships, and weapons. Destroying these cottage industries meant targeting the neighborhoods themselves. In Washington, the arithmetic of destruction was brutally simple. Every ton of bombs dropped equaled fewer planes, fewer tanks, fewer bullets for Japan's army. But behind those numbers were human beings, and thousands of them, reduced to collateral output. In April and May, The B-29 shifted focus to smaller cities. LeMay believed no urban area of military value should remain intact. Kawasaki, Kure, Toyama. The results were catastrophic. Toyama, a city of 170,000, was 99.5% destroyed in a single night raid. For the air crews, the missions had become mechanical. Load, fly, drop, return. Each operation bled into the next. The only real difference was the shape of the coastlines below and the pattern of fire that bloomed afterward. Yet even they began to sense the moral cost. Corporal James Doolin, a radio operator aboard the Hell's Angel II, wrote in his log, "It's strange. You can't hear them scream from this height, but you can almost feel it. You can feel the city dying beneath you." A nation at its breaking point by the summer of 1945, more than 60 Japanese cities lay in ruins. Nearly 500,000 civilians were dead. Millions more were homeless. In Tokyo, the survivors lived among ashes, boiling rice in tin cans beside the foundations of their old homes. Hospitals overflowed with burn victims. Children wandered alone through the wreckage, clutching the hands of strangers. And yet, every night, the sky still roared for Japan's military leadership. The raids were not just devastating, and they were humiliating. Their proud Air Force, once the terror of the Pacific, now stood powerless. Even suicide pilots could not stop the onslaught. General Korichika Anami, Japan's war minister, was said to have stared silently at a map of Japan, each city marked by blackened dots. After a long pause, he whispered, "There will soon be nothing left to defend." Still, surrender was unthinkable. So the raids continued. Nagoya, April 14, Kobe, May 5. Yokohama, May 29th. Each time, the same pattern: the sirens, the glow, the fire, the silence after. The once proud cities of Japan had become little more than coordinates in a mission briefing. But even as fire consumed the nation, the most terrifying dawn was yet to come. Because LeMay and his airmen were about to receive a new weapon, one unlike anything the world had ever seen, a weapon that would make even the firebombing of Tokyo seem small by comparison. By the end of June 1945, Japan was no longer a nation at war. It was a nation in ruins. From the skies, reconnaissance photographs showed nothing but smoldering grids of ash where once stood the largest cities in Asia. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, all shattered beyond recognition. Factories that survived the flames had no electricity. Rail lines were twisted and useless. Food convoys couldn't move. And yet every night, the hum of the B-29 engines still haunted the people below. General Curtis LeMay had achieved exactly what he'd promised Washington: the systematic destruction of Japan's war industry. In truth, he'd destroyed much more than that. He'd annihilated the fabric of civilian life itself. By July, 64 major cities had been bombed. An estimated 500,000 civilians were dead, and over 5 million were homeless. The B-29s, once symbols of technological triumph, had become machines of dread, and unstoppable, omnipresent, almost godlike in their reach. Japanese pilots still took to the air when they could, but their machines coughed smoke and their tanks ran dry before they even reached combat altitude. The few that managed to intercept found themselves hopelessly outgunned. For every American bomber lost, Japan lost 10 fighters, sometimes more. The home islands trembled under exhaustion and disbelief. School children drilled with bamboo spears, told to defend the emperor to the death. Women carried buckets of sand against the next inferno. The sound of engines above became the rhythm of their despair. In July 1945, LeMay received new orders, not to end the bombing, but to prepare for a new kind of strike. From Tinian Island, engineers assembled something unlike anything ever built before: the atomic bomb. Even among hardened B-29 crews, whispers spread through the barracks about the special mission. Only a handful of men knew the truth, that the new weapon would make every firebombing raid before it seem almost merciful. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., the B-29 Enola Gay dropped Little Boy over Hiroshima. The flash was brighter than the sun. The shockwave flattened everything within miles. Tens of thousands vanished instantly. Their shadows burned into the walls of their homes. Firestorms followed, swallowing what remained. LeMay in his operations room received the report with cold efficiency. The weapon had worked exactly as intended. 3 days later, August 9th, a second B-29 boxcar carried Fat Man to Nagasaki. The pattern repeated: silence, flash, shockwave, fire. Another city vanished. Another 100,000 lives ended. For the Japanese military command, it was the final breaking point. Messages flooded Tokyo. The city is gone. There is no city. The Emperor's Council convened in the early hours of August 10th. Some argued to continue fighting, to resist invasion even at the cost of every last life. Others, for the first time, admitted the unthinkable. Japan could no longer defend itself. The B-29s had done what no invading army could have achieved. They had erased Japan's sense of invincibility. They had stripped the war of all illusion. In the early morning of August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice, calm, almost detached, echoed through the nation. For most of his subjects, it was the first time they had ever heard him speak. He called upon the people to endure the unendurable. Japan had surrendered. For those who survived the bombings, there was no celebration, only relief and silence. The engines that had filled their nights with terror finally stopped. The skies were quiet, but beneath that quiet, Japan was hollow. Its cities skeletal, its spirit scarred. And for the men who flew the B-29s, the end of the war did not bring joy. Many could not reconcile the scale of what they had done. They had followed orders. They had done their duty. But deep down they understood that their war had crossed a threshold, one from which humanity could never return. The smoke of Japan's cities lingered long after the last B-29 had returned to its base. Tokyo, once home to 7 million people, lay in ruins. Streets were filled with charred debris, collapsed homes, and the twisted remains of familiar neighborhoods. Even in the surviving districts, life had fractured. Water was scarce, food scarce, and fear remained palpable. Rebuilding seemed impossible. Factories needed for reconstruction had been destroyed alongside the war industries. Rail lines and bridges were gone. Hospitals were overwhelmed with survivors suffering burns, trauma, and disease. In the countryside, refugees trickled in, carrying the memory of cities turned to ash. Millions were homeless, wandering in search of food and shelter, their eyes haunted by nights of fire and soundless skies. Psychologically, Japan had been broken. The once proud Air Force no longer existed. Civilians had witnessed the destruction of cities, the loss of friends and family, and the inability of their government to protect them. Air raid drills, fire brigades, and bucket brigades, once symbols of resilience, were now exercises in futility. The very concept of normal life had been erased. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were only the final punctuation of a campaign already defined by terror from the skies. LeMay's strategy had achieved its goal. Japan surrendered without an Allied invasion, saving countless lives that would have been lost in street-by-street fighting. Yet the ethical questions remained unresolved. Critics argued that the B-29 fire raids and atomic strikes blurred the line between military target and civilian victim, establishing a precedent that haunted military strategists for decades. In Washington, the B-29 program was hailed as a technological triumph. Crews were decorated, airfields celebrated, and engineers lauded for creating an aircraft capable of changing the course of the war. The campaign demonstrated that air power could dictate the outcome of a war, even without a single army crossing enemy soil. It was a new form of warfare, precise in execution, devastating in effect, and terrifying in scale. For the survivors in Japan, memory became their only legacy. Children who had run through streets of fire grew up recounting nights of roaring engines, of cities that seemed to burn endlessly, of families lost. The B-29s were remembered not just as instruments of war, but as symbols of unstoppable force, a reminder of the fragility of life under modern technology. Historians later noted that the firebombing campaign directly shaped post-war military doctrine. Urban centers, once considered sanctuaries, were now recognized as strategic nodes. The psychological impact of aerial bombardment became a central factor in planning, influencing both conventional and nuclear strategies during the Cold War. LeMay himself remained unrepentant. In interviews years later, he defended the campaign as necessary, arguing that the destruction shortened the war and ultimately saved lives. Yet even he admitted that the firebombings were unlike anything seen before, a new horrifying dimension to the art of war. The B-29s that had returned night after night had done more than drop bombs. They had reshaped the understanding of conflict, showing that industrial might, technological innovation, and strategic ruthlessness could strike directly at the heart of a nation, civilian and military alike. By the time Japan signed the surrender, documents aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, the skies that had once thundered with B-29 engines were finally silent. The nation faced reconstruction, reckoning, and reflection, and for the men who had flown those aircraft, the memory of firestorms, of cities erased, and of lives extinguished would remain, a haunting testament to the power and the peril of total war. The story of the B-29 raids over Japan is more than a tale of planes and bombs. It is a story of human ingenuity and its capacity for destruction. It is the convergence of technology, strategy, and morality, where decisions made in a distant command center could ignite entire cities and reshape the fate of millions. Night after night, the B-29s returned indifferent to the lives below. Pilots followed orders, engineers refined machines, commanders calculated destruction, and civilians, powerless, watched the skies, learning that survival was fragile and fleeting. In the ash of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, the cost of modern warfare was written not in strategy, but in human suffering. Yet from that horror emerged a profound truth about warfare itself. The B-29 campaigns demonstrated that victory could no longer be measured solely by the defeat of armies, but by the capacity to disrupt the very fabric of society. Cities became battlefields. Civilians became participants, unwilling or unprepared. Technology dictated terms that humanity struggled to comprehend. At the same time, these raids forced reflection on moral responsibility. Could the end, the surrender of Japan, justify the means? Could the incineration of neighborhoods, the annihilation of children and elders ever be rationalized as necessary? For decades, scholars, veterans, and survivors wrestled with that question, knowing that the echoes of the B-29s would shape debates about aerial warfare, ethics, and human cost forever. The legacy of those nights is complex. It is a testament to American industrial might, to tactical innovation, and to the unforgiving logic of strategic command. But it is also a reminder of the fragility of civilization under the shadow of human ambition. The firestorms that leveled cities were more than weapons. They were mirrors reflecting the power and peril of technology unrestrained by compassion. Today, when the B-29s are silent, the lessons remain. War can be measured in miles of sky and tons of bombs, but it is ultimately measured in the lives left behind. And as humanity advances, the echoes of those nights in 1945 serve as a warning that the line between strategy and atrocity can be thinner than the clouds beneath a bomber's wings. In the quiet after the fire, history asks us to remember not just the destruction, but the humanity that endured despite it, the resilience that rose from ash, and the enduring question, what price are we willing to pay for victory?